My 6-year-old came home with scratches and begged me not to leave him at daycare anymore. Then I learned about Max. When I confronted his teacher, she just laughed and brushed it off as a game. I stayed silent then. But 3 days later I woke up to a call from animal control that left me shaken. This isn't just a story about a bad daycare. It's about a mother's instinct screaming bloody murder, a system that failed, and the terrifying realization that evil can hide in plain sight. My 6-year-old son started coming home with scratches, and I brushed it off. Just normal playground bumps, right? But then the pattern emerged, a chilling, escalating truth that turned my world upside down. It started with tiny marks, then deeper gouges, always on his arms and legs, never his face, never his torso, always where clothes could cover them. He used to beg for a puppy, but now he'd flinch if our neighbor just walked their golden retriever past our house. His teacher mentioned he fell, but her voice was flat, like she was reading from a script. Then came the long sleeves, even in sweltering 90-degree heat. Shorts? Forget it, even in our own backyard. My sister thought I was overreacting. Boys play rough, Sarah. You can't bubble wrap him. But when my son screamed when I tried to turn off his bedroom light, my mom instincts weren't whispering. They were screaming. I started watching him. Daycare drop-off became a full-blown battle, sobbing, clinging to the car door, begging me not to leave him. The director just gave that fake saccharine smile. Separation anxiety is perfectly normal. But this wasn't anxiety. This was terror. Pure terror. One evening I caught him practicing running circles around our kitchen table, timing himself with his toy watch, muttering, "Faster, faster. I have to be faster." When I asked him what he was doing, he froze. "Just playing, Mommy." But his hands were shaking. Then came the day I'll never forget. I was folding laundry, half listening, when I heard him talking to his stuffed dinosaur in his room. His little voice was so serious. "If you're very good and very quiet, she won't make you visit Max." My blood went cold. Max? Who the hell was Max? I tried to keep my voice casual at dinner, asking about it. His whole body went rigid. The fork fell from his hand. "Nobody, Mom. Just a game." His eyes darted to the door like he was calculating an escape. My 6-year-old was looking for escape routes in his own home. That night, while he slept, I checked his arms. I counted 17 different wounds in various stages of healing. Some fresh, some scabbing over. But what made my stomach drop? There was a pattern. 4 parallel marks, like something had raked across his skin. The daycare kept insisting he was accident-prone, but I'd seen accident injuries. These weren't accidents. I started documenting everything, photos of each new mark, a log of his behavior changes. He stopped playing outside at home. He'd stand at the sliding glass door for full minutes, scanning the backyard before stepping out. He started having accidents again. He hadn't wet the bed since he was 3. I found him sleeping in his closet one night. He said it was safer in small spaces. When I mentioned maybe switching daycares, he broke down completely. "No, Mommy, please," he sobbed. If I leave, Max will find me. Max knows where we live." Something inside me snapped. My baby was being hurt by someone at that daycare, someone who was threatening him, someone who had introduced him to this Max, who had my son practicing escape routes and checking door locks. I called the daycare receptionist, asking about any new staff, volunteers, or visitors named Max. She acted confused. "We don't have anyone named Max here." And there was something about the way she said it that made me think she was telling the truth. But still, I had to see it for myself. So I called in sick to work the next day. At 11 a.m. I parked across from the daycare, right when they'd be going outside. I watched the kids file out to the playground. My son hung back, trying to hide behind his teacher. Then I saw it. A beat-up truck in the side lot with dog crates in the back. Big crates, the kind for large breeds. My heart was pounding as one of the daycare workers, the young one who always seemed frazzled, Jessica, walked over to the truck. I followed as she led my son around the building, away from the other kids, away from the cameras. He was dragging his feet, shoulders shaking. I crept closer, phone recording. What I saw made me physically ill. She was forcing him to train her rescue dog. This massive, snarling pit mix that she kept calling Max. "He needs to learn that dogs can sense fear," she said as the dog lunged at my baby. The dog was wearing a muzzle, but then she reached down and removed it. This builds real men. My 6-year-old was cowering, crying as this untrained, aggressive animal jumped on him, scratched him, snapped at his arms. Called 911 right there. Animal control, the police, everyone. This monster had been doing this to multiple kids, the quiet ones, the ones whose parents worked long hours, the ones who could be intimidated into silence. But when the officers arrived, They told me there was no evidence she intended to harm the children. That's when I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. I sat in my car for 20 minutes after calling 911, watching two officers lean against their patrol car while Jessica stood there, arms crossed. That same fake concerned look she always wore when parents asked questions. Other parents started pulling up for pickup, glancing at the police cars, whispering, some even taking pictures. The officers weren't taking notes. They weren't calling for backup. They weren't even looking at the truck with the dog crate still visible in the back. One of them actually laughed at something Jessica said. I pulled out my phone and started recording, my hands shaking so badly I had to prop it against the steering wheel. The officer closest to me kept checking his watch, like he had somewhere better to be. After maybe 10 minutes of casual chatting, they shook Jessica's hand and walked back to their cars. Just like that. No arrest, no investigation, no animal control. I watched Jessica wave at them as they drove away. Then she turned and smiled directly at my car. She knew I was watching. She wanted me to see that nothing was going to happen to her. I drove home in a daze, Ethan silent in the back seat, his little body pressed against the door as far from me as he could get. At dinner he wouldn't touch his mac and cheese. He just kept asking if the dog lady was going to come to our house. I promised him she wouldn't, but I saw him get up 3 times to check the front door lock, then the back door, then all the windows. His small fingers testing each latch twice before moving to the next one. That night, I sat at my laptop and typed out an email to every parent email I had from the daycare directory. I attached photos of Ethan's arms, screenshots from the video I took, everything. Within an hour my phone rang. It was Marcy, the daycare director. Her voice was ice cold as she told me I was opening myself up to serious legal consequences for defamation and breach of privacy. I hit record on my phone before she even finished her first threat. She went on for 5 minutes about lawsuits and restraining orders, and how I was disturbing the peace of mind of other families. 3 parents responded to my email that night. 2 told me I was overreacting, that kids get hurt all the time. But one dad, Miguel, sent me photos of his daughter's arms from last month. Scratches that looked exactly like Ethan's. He'd thought it was playground equipment, but now he wasn't sure. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound from Ethan's room and found his bed empty. He was in his closet, wrapped in his dinosaur blanket, whispering over and over that Max couldn't fit in small spaces. I laid down next to him on that closet floor, feeling like the worst mother in the world for not protecting him sooner. The next morning I drove past the daycare. Jessica's truck was in the parking lot. She was leading a group of kids out to the playground like nothing had happened. I called Child Protective Services from my car, but the woman on the phone told me an investigation could take 30 to 90 days to even begin. 90 days. 3 more months of kids being terrorized by that dog. I took Ethan to see Dr. Morrison that afternoon. She documented every single scratch, took photos, measured them, noted in her report that they were consistent with animal scratches, not typical playground injuries. She filed a mandatory reporter form right there in front of me and gave me copies of everything. Tom, my husband, finally called me back from his business trip in Phoenix after I'd left him 6 voicemails. He started with his usual dismissive tone about me being dramatic again, but when I sent him the photos he went completely silent. I counted the seconds. 43. Then he said he'd catch the first flight back tomorrow. 2 days later, Marcy called an emergency parent meeting at the daycare. I walked in to find she'd hired a lawyer who stood at the front of the room with a PowerPoint presentation about harassment and defamation. The lawyer pointed at me and said I was attempting to destroy a small business with unfounded accusations. I watched several parents nodding along, avoiding eye contact with me. After the meeting, Miguel caught up with me in the parking lot and showed me more photos on his phone. Not just of his daughter, but screenshots from a parent Facebook group where 3 other families had mentioned unexplained scratches over the past 6 months. He told me he'd been driving past the daycare on weekends and Jessica's truck was always there, even though the place was supposed to be closed. That night Linda, my sister, showed up at my door with a bottle of wine, and that look she gets when she thinks I'm overreacting. She walked into the living room, swinging her purse off her shoulder, and Ethan immediately pressed himself against the wall, arms up, protecting his face. The purse hadn't even come close, but he was shaking and whimpering. Linda froze mid-step and stared at my son, who was trying to make himself as small as possible against our beige wall. Her face went from skeptical to horrified in about 2 seconds. She set her purse down real slow and knelt down, speaking soft words to Ethan, who finally uncurled and ran to his room. While she sat there, processing what she'd just seen, I grabbed my laptop and started searching Jessica's name on Facebook. Found her profile pretty quick and started scrolling. 3 months back, she'd shared something from a page called Pause for progress dog training. I clicked through and my stomach dropped. Jessica ran this whole side business about using child socialization therapy to fix aggressive dogs. The website had all these testimonials from dog owners about how their pets were transformed, but zero credentials anywhere. No insurance info, no certifications, just photos of kids playing with dogs and vague language about innovative behavioral modification. I screenshotted everything and called Detective Ray Coleman the next morning. He showed up at my house looking annoyed and kept checking his watch while I spread out my evidence folder on the kitchen table. He started giving me the whole speech about how kids play rough with animals and accidents happen. Then I pulled up Jessica's website on my phone and showed him the part where she bragged about reforming aggressive dogs using innovative child interaction techniques. His whole body language changed. He leaned forward and asked me to send him that link immediately. Tom came by that afternoon to pick up some of his old tools from the garage. Ethan heard his dad's voice from the living room. Instead of running to greet him like he always did, our son bolted straight to his bedroom and slammed the door. Tom looked confused and went to check on him. He found Ethan building this massive fortress out of every pillow and blanket in his room. When Tom asked what he was doing, Ethan just kept stacking pillows higher and said he needed to be ready for when Max comes to our house. Tom came back downstairs white as a sheet and finally started asking real questions about what had been happening. My phone rang that evening. A woman named Rebecca introduced herself, real nervous. She said she'd heard from another parent that I was asking questions about the daycare. Her son had been removed 6 months ago for what they called behavioral issues, but she knew something else was going on. She had videos on her phone of her 4-year-old having night terrors where he'd scream about the bad dog and Miss Jessica's games. She sent me 3 videos. I couldn't watch more than 30 seconds of each one. Her kid was thrashing in bed, yelling, "No more games, leave me alone," over and over. The next day, Dr. Elena Torres called, saying she'd heard about our situation from a colleague and wanted to help. She came to the house that afternoon with a bag of toys and spent 2 hours with Ethan in his room. I watched from the doorway as he used stuffed animals to show her what happened at daycare. He made the teddy bear be himself and the toy tiger was Max. He showed her how Jessica would take off the muzzle when kids cried because tears mean you're not trying hard enough. He demonstrated how they had to stand very still while the dog jumped on them, and if they moved or made noise, Jessica would remove the muzzle completely. Dr. Torres was taking notes the whole time, tears running down her face. 2 days later, Marcy showed up at my front door at 7 a.m., waving legal papers in my face. A cease and desist letter from some lawyer, saying I was defaming the daycare and harassing staff. I told her I wasn't backing down, and she started yelling about how I was ruining her business over nothing. Linda had been recording from the kitchen and stepped into view right when Marcy said she knew Jessica brought her dog sometimes, but it was therapeutic for the children. Marcy's face went pale when she saw the phone recording. She grabbed her papers and practically ran to her car. Detective Coleman called me later that week. He'd been digging into Jessica's background. Turns out she'd been fired from 2 other daycares in Moreno Valley and Paris, both times for what the records called inappropriate animal interactions. But neither place had filed formal charges. One director told him off the record that Jessica had been caught having kids play with her rescue dogs during that time. That evening, I was doing dishes when I heard Ethan in the living room with his toys. I peeked around the corner and saw him holding his favorite dinosaur up to his other stuffed animals. He was teaching them, in this serious little voice, how to be very quiet and very still so the dog won't see you, demonstrating how to breathe shallow and not blink too much. My 6-year-old was teaching survival tactics to his toys. I had to run to the bathroom so he wouldn't see me crying. I filed a claim with the daycare's insurance company the next morning. Within 2 days, an investigator named Marcus Webb was calling me. But instead of asking about Ethan's injuries, he kept asking if I had proof of intent to harm, and whether I'd considered other explanations for the scratches. Every question was about protecting the daycare, not about what happened to my son. The next morning, I was sitting in a lawyer's office downtown, watching this guy in a cheap suit shuffle through papers while telling me how hard it would be to get any money from the daycare without criminal charges being filed first. 6 to 8 months minimum just to get to court, $20,000 in legal fees up front. And even then, we'd probably settle for less than the medical bills. Tom finally took time off from his job to watch Ethan while I dealt with all this mess. When he called me that afternoon, his voice was shaking. He'd never noticed before how our son checked every single room before walking in, standing in doorways for 10 or 15 seconds, just scanning for danger. Tom said watching it made him sick to his stomach. That same day, a mom named Rebecca Johnson started a private Facebook group after hearing about what happened to Ethan. Within 3 hours, we had 3 more families posting about their kids coming home with scratches and bite marks. Every single one of them had quiet kids who never caused trouble. Every single one worked long hours. And Jessica had been alone with all of them during special training time. Dr. Elena sent over her preliminary report that Thursday, and the words made my hands shake as I read them. Complex trauma consistent with repeated threat exposure. Hypervigilance requiring immediate intervention. Recommendation for removal from all triggering environments. She wanted Ethan in therapy 3 times a week minimum. Friday morning, one of the other daycare workers pulled me aside in the parking lot and whispered that they were planning to transfer Jessica to their sister location in the next county before any investigation could really get started. The director had already started the paperwork. I couldn't let that happen. So I followed Jessica's truck when she left work that day, staying 3 cars back like I'd seen in movies. She drove out past the city limits to this rundown property with chain-link fencing and no trespassing signs everywhere. I parked down the road and walked back through the trees, phone recording everything. She had 6 dogs out there, all of them scarred up and mean-looking. And I watched her throw 2 of them in a pen together while they went at each other's throats. She was laughing, actually laughing, while these animals tore into each other, yelling stuff about making them tougher. Detective Ray finally called me back and said he was opening an official investigation, but warned it could take weeks to get warrants and even longer to build a case. The best he could do was have a patrol car drive by the daycare once or twice a day. Meanwhile, Ethan had started drawing pictures during his therapy sessions with Dr. Elena. When she showed them to me, I had to leave the room. Every single drawing showed a little boy running from these black shapes with red mouths full of teeth. And in the last one, the boy had stopped running and was just standing there while the shape circled him. I was loading groceries into my car at the store when Jessica appeared right behind me, so close I could smell cigarettes on her breath. "You have no idea what you're messing with," she said real quiet. "Accidents happen to nosy parents all the time." I managed to get my phone recording before she walked away, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely drive home. The next breakthrough came when Miguel's daughter finally opened up to Dr. Elena about what really happened during those training sessions. She said Jessica would make any kid who cried stand completely still while Max jumped on them over and over, calling it bravery training, saying they needed to learn to be tough or they'd never make it in the real world. That same night, Tom called me saying he'd found footprints in our backyard that didn't match any of our shoes, and he was coming over with security cameras. He showed up at midnight with a box full of cameras and started drilling holes in the siding, while Ethan watched from his bedroom window, asking if the cameras could see dogs too. Tom installed 4 cameras covering every angle of the house and showed me the app on my phone where I could watch the feeds. I noticed his hands were shaking as he tested each one. The next morning, Marcy sent an email to all the parents announcing the daycare was conducting an internal review of their safety procedures. But Jessica would remain employed during the investigation because there was no proof of wrongdoing. She actually wrote that I was conducting a witch hunt against an innovative educator who was just trying to help children build confidence through structured activities. Linda called me from her office at the county clerk's building where she'd been digging through old records during her lunch breaks. She discovered Jessica had been sued twice before in other states. Both cases were sealed, but the filing codes indicated they involved minors and animals. One case in Oregon had resulted in a restraining order that Jessica had violated 3 times before moving to California. I was meeting Ray at the police station to give him copies of Linda's findings when I heard a loud hissing sound from the parking lot. All 4 of my tires were slashed with deep cuts. The security footage from the station's cameras showed someone in a black hoodie doing it, but the build and height matched Jessica perfectly. Though Ray said he couldn't arrest anyone based on body type alone. That night, Ethan crawled into my bed at 2 a.m., saying Max knew where his room was. I held him while he had nightmares, whimpering over and over that he was being good and being quiet, just like Jessica taught him. A reporter named Amy Huang called the next day after someone in the parent Facebook group had contacted the news station. The story went viral within hours, and the daycare's corporate office announced they were launching a formal investigation and placing Marcy on administrative leave immediately while they reviewed all the complaints. Elena organized a support group meeting at the community center, and 5 families showed up with stories that made my stomach turn. Kids who wouldn't go near dogs anymore. Kids who had started wetting the bed. Kids with the same 4-line scratch patterns on their arms. Tom moved back into the house the next week, sleeping on the couch with a baseball bat next to him. And even though we barely talked except about Ethan's schedule, our son watched us constantly like he was waiting for us to start fighting. Jessica made her biggest mistake when she posted on Facebook about weak modern parents who couldn't handle real child development methods, and how kids today were being raised as snowflakes who would never survive in the real world. Rebecca Williams from the parent group screenshotted everything, including the comments where Jessica called us pathetic and said our kids needed to toughen up or they'd end up as victims their whole lives. All captured before Jessica deleted the post 20 minutes later. Ray finally got a judge to sign a search warrant for Jessica's property. What they found made even the seasoned officers sick to their stomachs. She had built makeshift training equipment in her garage, including child-sized wooden barriers she'd force kids to stand behind while the dogs jumped at them, rope restraints attached to the walls at kid height, and a notebook documenting which children cried the most during her sessions. The cops arrested Jessica that same afternoon, and I watched from my window as they put her in the back of the patrol car while news vans pulled up to film everything. Ray called me later that night to tell me she'd made bail already. I couldn't believe what I was hearing until he explained her mother had posted the whole amount in cash. Turns out Jessica's mom was some big shot donor who'd been giving money to local politicians for years and had connections everywhere. The next morning, Ethan saw Jessica's arrest on the news while eating breakfast. For the first time in weeks, he actually asked if he could play in the backyard, though he still carried his toy watch with him and kept checking it every few minutes. I met with the district attorney William Hayes 2 days later. He sat me down in his office with this look on his face that told me everything before he even opened his mouth. Jessica's family had hired some fancy defense firm from Los Angeles, and he warned me this case could take 12 to 18 months to go to trial with no guarantee we'd win. I was still processing that when I got home that night and found my front window smashed with a brick sitting in my living room wrapped in a note that said, "Drop the charges or next time it won't be glass that breaks." Ray came over right away and said he'd increase patrols but couldn't give us round-the-clock protection since technically nothing could be proven about who threw it. Amy's news segment finally aired 3 nights later, and my phone started ringing non-stop with other parents calling to say they'd noticed similar things with their kids but hadn't put it together until now. The daycare's phones were apparently ringing off the hook with angry parents, and I heard through Linda that 3 of their big corporate sponsors had already pulled their funding. Linda came over for dinner that weekend with her kids, and I found Ethan in the playroom, showing his 5-year-old cousin how to be safe from dogs by demonstrating escape routes and teaching him to always know where the doors were. Linda pulled me aside later, tears in her eyes, saying she finally understood that my baby had gone from being a normal kid to someone who thought like a survivor. Jessica started driving past our house the next week, and I caught her on our security camera doing it 4 times in 2 days. But when Ray tried to do something about it, her lawyer argued it was just a coincidental route to her mother's house. Elena had to testify at a preliminary hearing about the 7 kids she'd evaluated. Jessica's defense attorney, Martin Keller, stood up there arguing that Elena was creating false memories through suggestion, and that kids were just repeating what their parents told them. Tom finally showed up to help and took Ethan to tour a new private school. Ethan asked the principal detailed questions about their dog policy, whether teachers stayed with kids at all times, and if they had cameras on the playground. The principal looked at Tom confused, because no 6-year-old should need to ask those things. But Tom just put his hand on Ethan's shoulder and said, "These are important questions to us now." Then Rebecca Brown called me crying because her son finally had a breakthrough in therapy and told his therapist about what Jessica called graduation day, where she would take off Max's muzzle completely and let him chase the kids who had failed her program around the garage while she laughed and took notes. The next morning, the local news showed the daycare with chains on the doors and a big notice saying their license was gone. Marcy stood there in front of cameras, mascara running down her face, saying, "I had destroyed 30 families who worked there and left hundreds of parents scrambling for childcare." She kept repeating that one disturbed mother had ruined everything over normal childhood accidents. The reporter asked about the abuse claims, but Marcy just walked away, shaking her head. 3 days later, I was pushing my cart through the produce section at Vaughn's when this older woman blocked my path. She looked just like Jessica, but 20 years older with the same cold eyes. Patricia Reeves started yelling right there by the bananas that I was persecuting her daughter for being an innovative educator. Other shoppers stopped and stared as she followed me through the store, screaming about how Jessica was just building character in weak children. The manager had to escort her out while she kept shouting that I'd pay for this. I went back to work part-time the following week, but couldn't focus on anything. My supervisor pulled me aside and said she'd seen the news and I could take whatever time I needed. Every time I walked past the break room, conversation stopped. Some coworkers would pat my shoulder, while others just looked away like they didn't know what to say. Ray called me that afternoon with news that made my hands shake. He'd found records from Texas showing Jessica had worked at a daycare in Austin 5 years ago. A 4-year-old named Marcus Chun ended up in the hospital with dog bites all over his arms. The family filed charges but suddenly dropped everything and moved to Oregon 2 weeks later. Nobody would say why. That weekend, Tom brought Ethan over, and for the first time in months I heard my baby laugh. They were building Legos on the living room floor, and Ethan was actually smiling. Then a FedEx truck pulled up outside, and the diesel engine made this deep rumbling sound. Ethan's whole body went rigid. He dropped the Legos and ran to his closet. Tom found him curled up behind the winter coats, whispering that Max was coming. All that progress gone in seconds. I spent the next 3 days calling every parent from the daycare and organizing them for a meeting at the community center. 23 families showed up, ready to fight. We hired a lawyer together to file a civil suit against the daycare's parent company in Sacramento. The corporate office tried to claim they had no knowledge of Jessica's methods, but we had emails showing Marcy had been sending reports for months. Then my phone rang at midnight with a blocked number. A woman named Carol Chun said she was Marcus's mother from Texas. She told me they'd been paid $50,000 to sign papers and leave the state. She still had copies of everything, including photos of Marcus's injuries that looked exactly like Ethan's marks. She said if we could get her immunity from the NDA, she'd testify about everything Jessica did to her son. Elena called the next morning saying she wanted to try something new with Ethan. She brought this golden retriever named Butterscotch who was trained as a therapy dog. Ethan stood in the doorway of Elena's office for 20 minutes, just watching the dog lay there, wagging her tail. Finally, he took one tiny step forward before backing up again. Elena said it was huge progress, but my heart broke watching my brave boy afraid of a dog who just wanted to love him. Jessica's lawyer filed motion after motion trying to get the charges dropped. He argued there was no physical evidence and called it mass parental hysteria. Judge Sandra Liu denied every motion, but she pulled the prosecutor aside afterward. I was close enough to hear her say she was concerned about putting traumatized children on the stand. The prosecutor looked worried as he walked past me. Then Jennifer Walsh called me crying. She'd worked at the daycare for 3 months before quitting, and she had videos on her phone. She'd been secretly recording Jessica's training sessions because something felt wrong, but she'd been too scared to report it. The video showed Jessica laughing while Max jumped on kids who were screaming and trying to get away. You could see the terror on their faces as she took notes on a clipboard. Jennifer said she'd testify if we could protect her from Jessica's family. Ray said he'd put Jennifer in protective custody until the trial. 2 weeks later, Tom finally showed up to the counseling session Dr. Torres had been pushing for. He sat on the opposite end of the couch like I had something catching, started going on about how I should have told him sooner, how I kept him out of the loop on purpose. The counselor kept trying to redirect us to focus on Ethan, but Tom wouldn't stop bringing up old fights. Finally, she said what mattered was getting Ethan through this together. Tom nodded, but I could tell he was still mad. That same afternoon, Jessica's lawyer went on the news, said the kids were hurting themselves for attention, that I was coaching them to lie. The reporter looked shocked. People online went crazy. Parents from the daycare started posting their own stories. Photos of their kids' injuries, videos of their children having nightmares. The lawyer had to delete his social media accounts within hours. Amy called me that night with something big. She'd been digging into Jessica's family, found court records showing Jessica's mom, Patricia, had been sued 3 times, all for her dogs attacking people. One kid needed 20 stitches. Another lost part of their ear. The pattern went back 15 years. Patricia always claimed the victims provoked her dogs. Always settled out of court. Always got new dogs right after. Amy sent everything to Ray and the prosecutor. The next morning, Ethan was coloring at the kitchen table when he looked up at me. Asked if Jessica would have to go to timeout like he does when he's bad. I tried to explain that grown-ups who hurt kids go somewhere different. He kept asking if she'd get juice boxes and nap time there. I didn't know how to explain prison to a 6-year-old. I just told him she wouldn't be able to hurt any more kids. He went back to coloring, but his hand was shaking. 3 days later was Jessica's deposition. Ray let me watch through a video link from another room. The prosecutor was asking about her training methods when Jessica exploded. Started screaming that kids today were too soft, that they needed to learn fear to become strong. Her lawyer grabbed her arm, but she kept going. Said parents were raising weak babies who couldn't handle the real world. The court reporter was typing everything. Jessica's lawyer dragged her out of the room, but the damage was done. The prosecutor had everything on record. Within a week the DA called. Said they were upgrading the charges to felony child abuse. Multiple counts. Jessica's bail was revoked after they found out she'd been calling parents from jail, threatening them. The trial was set for 6 months out. Jessica would stay locked up until then. I thought things would calm down, but then Tom's phone rang during Ethan's therapy session. Some woman saying she was a family friend, wanted to meet me for coffee to discuss the situation. Tom gave her my number before I could stop him. She called that night, said her name was Carol, that Patricia wanted to make things right. Started talking about how hard this must be financially, how moving somewhere new could help Ethan heal. Then she said it. $100,000 to drop the charges and leave town. I hit record on my phone, asked her to repeat the offer. She did. Even said Patricia would throw in another $50,000 for moving expenses. I sent the recording to Ray before she finished talking. He had officers at Patricia's house within an hour. She was arrested for witness tampering and bribery. Tom finally started taking this seriously after that. He showed up for every therapy appointment. Even took time off work when Ethan started first grade at his new school. Ethan grabbed my hand so tight that morning, made me walk him all the way to his classroom door. The teacher was nice, had a calm voice. Ethan stayed the whole day without calling to come home. I picked him up and he was actually smiling. Said his teacher let him be the door holder. Small win, but I'd take it. Meanwhile, our lawyer was pushing the civil case against the daycare corporation. They fought hard until the judge ordered them to release their internal emails. Hundreds of messages showing they knew about complaints against Jessica. Parents had been reporting concerns for months, but Jessica accepted lower pay than other workers. The emails showed them discussing how she saved them money, how replacing her would cost more. They kept her knowing she was hurting kids. Our lawyer said it was the smoking gun we needed. That night, I was cleaning Ethan's room when I heard him in the playroom. He had his toy dogs out for the first time since everything happened. Was making them protect a little action figure, making them bark at invisible bad guys, telling the action figure the dogs were nice and would keep him safe. I stood in the doorway watching him reclaim his story, making the dogs the heroes instead of the monsters. He looked up and saw me, smiled and kept playing. Small steps but forward ones. 3 weeks later, Jennifer called me at 2 a.m., crying so hard I could barely understand her words. Someone had jumped her in the parking garage after her late shift at the hospital, pushed her against her car and grabbed her throat, told her if she showed up to testify, they'd finish what they started. She had bruises all around her neck and a cut above her eye from hitting the concrete. The security guard found her 20 minutes later, still shaking on the ground. Detective Coleman reviewed the garage footage and spotted Patricia's beat-up Honda circling the area 3 times before the attack. They arrested Patricia that morning for witness tampering, and she went straight to county lockup. Elena started working with all 7 kids twice a week at the courthouse to get them ready. She had this special room set up with a fake witness stand and microphone. Ethan would practice saying his name into the mic and pointing to where Jessica sat. His voice got stronger each time he practiced telling what happened with Max. The other kids did the same thing, and Elena recorded everything to show they could handle testifying. Tom finally moved back from Phoenix and got a small apartment 10 minutes from our house. He'd been gone for 2 years, but now wanted to be here for the trial. Ethan made this calendar on his wall with red X marks counting down to the court date. He'd stare at it every morning like he was afraid, but also needed it to happen. The jail called Detective Coleman at 4 a.m., saying Jessica had tried to hang herself with her bed sheets. The guards found her just in time and rushed her to the hospital. She left a 3-page note blaming me for ruining her life and destroying her work with children. Said I was a jealous mother who couldn't understand her methods. The doctors kept her on suicide watch for 2 weeks while the judge decided if she was stable enough for trial. Her lawyer tried to argue she needed mental treatment instead of prosecution, but the psychiatrist said she knew right from wrong. The judge ruled she was competent, and jury selection started the next Monday. They brought in 60 people and the lawyers asked them all kinds of questions. Did they have kids? What did they think about discipline? Had they ever owned dogs? It took 4 days to pick 12 jurors and 2 alternates. Opening statements started on a Tuesday morning, and the courtroom was packed with parents and reporters. The prosecutor was this woman named Monica Rivera, who laid out everything in order. She showed photos of the kids' injuries and explained Jessica's pattern of targeting quiet children. The defense lawyer argued Jessica was trying new therapy techniques that got misunderstood. Said she was helping kids overcome fear through controlled exposure. Jennifer testified on day 3, and the jury looked sick when they saw her videos. She had filmed Jessica removing Max's muzzle while kids screamed and tried to run. You could hear Jessica laughing in the background, saying the kids needed to toughen up. One juror covered her mouth when she saw Max jumping on a 4-year-old. When it was my turn to testify, the defense lawyer kept interrupting and calling me overprotective. Asked if I'd ever let Ethan ride a bike without training wheels or climb a tree. Tried to make it seem like I was the kind of mom who panicked over nothing. I stayed calm and just kept describing what I saw that day behind the daycare. Elena took the stand with 7 folders of therapy notes and showed the jury matching trauma patterns. Every single kid had the same nightmares about dogs and the same fear responses. The defense brought their own expert who tried to say kids could be coached, but Elena had timestamps on everything. She showed therapy sessions from before any parent knew what was happening. Miguel testified last, along with 3 other parents whose kids had scratches and bite marks. Their kids had all started wetting the bed and refusing to go outside. One dad broke down crying when he described finding his daughter hiding in the bathtub, fully dressed, because she thought Max was coming. The judge called for a 15-minute recess after that, and I went to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. Tom was waiting in the hallway with Ethan, who had his crayon spread across the bench. My baby was drawing something, and when I got closer, I saw it was our family standing together under a rainbow. The first happy picture he'd made since this whole nightmare started. He handed it to me without looking up and kept coloring in the grass at the bottom. The bailiff called us back in, and what happened next made everyone in that courtroom sick. Jessica's lawyer tried to stop her, but she insisted on taking the stand. She sat there in her navy suit, looking completely calm, and told the jury she was helping these kids overcome modern weakness. Said parents today were raising soft children who couldn't handle real life. The prosecutor just let her talk, and she kept digging her own grave deeper. She explained how her methods would make these kids stronger, and how grateful they'd be someday. 2 jurors were visibly shaking their heads, and one woman in the back row had tears running down her face. The prosecutor finally stood up and asked Jessica about her qualifications. She admitted she had no training in child development, no certification in animal behavior, just some online articles she'd read about exposure therapy. Her lawyer kept objecting, but the damage was done. She destroyed her own defense in 20 minutes. The judge decided Ethan would testify from another room through a TV screen, so he wouldn't have to see Jessica. They set up the equipment and brought him into a small office down the hall with Dr. Torres beside him. His little voice came through the speaker so clear when the prosecutor asked him about the games at daycare. He said Miss Jessica made him play with Max even when he was scared. Said she told him crying was for babies. The defense lawyer tried to ask if maybe he misunderstood, but Ethan just looked straight at the camera and said he knew the difference between games and being hurt. The whole gallery went silent after that. Closing arguments took 2 hours, with the prosecutor showing photos of 17 different kids with injuries while Jessica's lawyer desperately tried to argue there was reasonable doubt about her intentions. The jury left to deliberate at 3 p.m., and we all just waited. Tom and I sat in the hallway drinking terrible courthouse coffee while Linda stayed home with Ethan. 2 days passed with no word, and I was going crazy thinking maybe they'd let her walk. Then finally, the bailiff came out and said they'd reached a verdict. My hands were shaking so bad Tom had to hold them as we walked back into the courtroom. Jessica stood when the judge asked and showed absolutely no emotion as the foreman read, "Guilty on all counts." Behind us, Patricia started screaming about injustice and how we'd ruined an innocent woman's life before security dragged her out. I didn't feel like celebrating even though we'd won. I just felt empty and tired. Tom drove me home, and I called Ethan from the car to tell him the news. His response broke my heart all over again when he asked if this meant Max couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I told him, "Yes, baby. That's exactly what it means," and heard him tell Linda that the bad lady was going away. 6 weeks later, we were back in court for sentencing. Jessica got 8 years with mandatory psychological treatment. Parents lined up to give impact statements about their kids still having nightmares and refusing to go near dogs. One mom said her daughter hadn't played outside in 4 months. Another dad talked about thousands in therapy bills. The daycare's insurance company didn't even fight the civil suit and settled for $2.3 million split between all the families. I put Ethan's portion straight into accounts for his therapy in college because I knew we had a long road ahead of us still. The next few months were all about therapy sessions and small steps forward. Elena had been working with Ethan twice a week at first, then 3 times using this therapy dog named Butterscotch who was trained to be super gentle with scared kids. For 6 months, Ethan wouldn't even look at the dog, just sat on the opposite side of the room with his back turned, while Elena talked to him about other stuff. And then one day, I was sitting in the waiting room, and Elena came out with tears in her eyes and told me to come look through the observation window. Ethan was sitting on the floor, and Butterscotch had her head in his lap while he petted her really carefully with just his fingertips. His face had this smile I hadn't seen since before everything happened, like he'd forgotten to be scared for just that moment. I went back to work full-time after that because sitting at home just made me replay everything over and over. I found out there was this whole movement of parents pushing for better daycare oversight, and I started going to meetings at the state capitol. I stood up in front of a room full of legislators and told them exactly what happened to my son because the system failed to protect him. They passed new requirements for background checks and mandatory reporting training 3 months later. Tom finally stepped up too. Started taking Ethan to therapy sometimes and even took him to a baseball game one Saturday. He called me from the stadium to tell me Ethan actually cheered when their team scored. Forgot to check the exits for a whole inning. The other families from the daycare started meeting up at this park once a month, letting our kids play while we shared lawyer recommendations and therapy resources. Rebecca Davis, whose daughter was one of the other victims, announced she was starting a nonprofit to help families dealing with daycare abuse. We all chipped in what we could. Then the news came that Patricia got convicted of witness tampering and bribery for trying to pay off that maintenance worker. 18 months in prison plus 3 years probation. Felt like the last piece of the toxic system finally got taken down. Ethan started asking about getting a pet around his 7th birthday. Not a dog, but maybe a hamster or a guinea pig. Elena said it was huge that he wanted to take care of something small and helpless. We went to 3 different pet stores before he picked out this tiny brown hamster he named Coco. Tom and I had been working with a mediator to figure out custody stuff and finally signed the papers making everything official. We'd never get back together, but at least we could be in the same room without fighting. Both focused on what Ethan needed. Elena cut his therapy down to twice a month, then once a month. Said he was making real progress even though he still had rough days. Bad dreams sometimes, still checked locks. But the good days were getting more common. I'd watch him playing with the neighbor kids in our front yard. Noticed he never went more than 20 feet from our door, and kept looking back to make sure I was still on the porch. Recovery was going to take years, but at least he wasn't living in constant fear anymore. His 7th birthday party had 15 kids from his new school. Tom came with his girlfriend. Linda brought her kids and we had cake in the backyard. When our neighbor walked by with their golden lab, I held my breath, waiting for Ethan to panic. He just moved closer to where I was standing and kept opening presents. Didn't run, didn't cry, just shifted position and kept going. The dog walked past, and he went back to showing his friends his new Lego set. That night, after everyone left and I was cleaning up, I found him in his room playing with Coco, telling the hamster about his party and all his new toys. No more sleeping in closets. No more practicing escape routes. Just a 7-year-old boy talking to his pet about his birthday. The war we'd been fighting was finally over, even if the healing would keep going for a long, long time.